When dealing with critical fundamentals, the first topic we need to discuss is the execution context. Understanding how the execution context is set up and works aids in understanding hoisting and scope. The execution context is created by the JavaScript engine using the memory heap and call stack. Now let's first look at a couple of definitions of the execution context. So one, a wrapper that contains information for managing the code that is executed. Or another way to say it, the environment in which the code executes. And so our JavaScript code is running inside of an environment and has access to certain things. That is our execution context. So a way to think about that is the environment in which our code is running. And I think the best way to explain this is using some sample code. So let's try a few things first. So here I have a basic HTML file. Not a whole lot in it. We have attached one JavaScript file, and the JavaScript file currently has nothing in it. Let's go ahead and run this HTML file in the browser with this blank JavaScript file and see what happens. So I'm going to jump to the HTML file and use live server, and that comes up for us. Let me go ahead and open up the console. Now I want to show you a couple of things that we already have access to simply because of the execution context. Here's one of these. It's window. We have an object called window. Window is the global object. And so this is the global execution context that has been set up. And one of the things that is set up is window, the global object. And that's called window in the browser. We also have the keyword this set up. And notice that this is a reference to that global object, in this case window. So we're seeing the exact same things here. So those are already set up for us, and this is the global execution context. So when any JavaScript file starts running, this is the environment that it runs in. These things are already established, among other things which we'll be talking about. So first off, we can see that the JavaScript engine sets up this context. It is the very first thing that is done because we haven't put any JavaScript code in that file, and this has still happened. I've been referring to it as a global execution context, but it can also be referred and is sometimes referred to as a global environment. Either way, it sets up that global object and assigns a reference to that global object for this. So those two things are established. Now, we're looking at a browser here. What happens with Node? Let's just take a quick look before we continue on. So if I jump back to Visual Studio Code and I open up the terminal inside of this, I'll just use this terminal. And I'm going to open up the Node REPL, or also called the Node shell, just by typing in Node. And basically what this does is it sets up the environment for us, the global execution environment. And let's see what we have inside of here. We do have a global object, but it's called global. It's not called window in Node. We can see that there are certain things attached to that. And if we type in this, we can see that this points to that global object. Now, before we leave the Node shell, you can close it by typing .exit. Now we'll go ahead and close it and take you out to the shell prompt. So in Node, a global execution context is set up as well. All right, now let's add a little bit of code and see how things are different with this execution context that is set up. So we're going to declare a variable and set it to 10. And then we'll just log that variable to the console. And then let's include a function declaration. We're going to call that num function. And what are we going to do with this simply log to the console message that we are inside of this function. That's all we'll do. And then finally down here, we will call this function. We'll invoke it by putting the parens after the function name. And that will invoke it. Then we'll go ahead and save that. Now, before we run this and find out what happens, I want to talk first about the phases of the global execution context. So when that is set up, there are two phases that JavaScript engine runs through. And this will help identify what the JavaScript engine is doing when it's setting up this global execution context. So let's take a look at that first. So phase one is considered the creation phase. And we've already seen a couple of things that happens in the creation phase. A global object is created. And in the browser, that's a window. In Node, that was global. So we saw that happen during the creation phase. And then also, this is created, and it's bound to the global object. So both of those things are set up. But there's something else that happens in the creation phase as well. And this one's key. So in the creation phase, a memory heap is established, and variables and function declarations are stored in the memory. That happens in the creation phase. Now, the second phase is the execution phase. So knowing that variables and functions are stored in memory before the lines of code are executed, before the code is run, is an important thing to be aware of. And so this is happening in the creation phase. Then phase two, it executes code line by line. Think of the call stack. This is our call stack working through the code. It assigns values to variables, and so a memory location was set up for those variables. The variable was established, but the value was not assigned until the execution phase. So once we start executing through the code, that's when the value is assigned. And then it invokes functions. So it comes to a function and invokes it. Now, if it's a function declaration, that function's already stored in memory, so it just locates it and begins running that code. So that's the execution phase. So two phases when we're setting up the global execution context. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our code and see what happens. So we're already running our code out here because we have live server. So we can see that the number 10 is printed, and then a log statement in num function is printed to the console. That's what happens. So let's come back to our code now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a bit smaller so we can see the console while we're making changes, so we can see what updates. I'm going to change some things around here. I'm going to move this declaration down below the console log statement. So we're logging num to the console before we declare it and assign information to it. Something else I'm going to do is put the call to the function up here. Now, those of you that have been around JavaScript for a while have seen this type of thing. But now we're going to talk about it inside of the execution context and the phases of setting that up. So if we think about this, phase one is the creation phase. The first thing it's going to do is come through this code. It's looking for a var and a function. Whenever it finds those two keywords, it's going to set up something in memory. It's going to put a location for num in memory. It's not going to assign it a value yet. It's simply going to set it up in memory. Same thing with function. It's going to set that up in memory. So the whole function will be stored in memory. That happens in the creation phase. Then we'll start going through lines of code, and that's where the value will be assigned, and that's where the function will be invoked. So knowing that, what's going to happen here? Let's go ahead and save that and see how things change. Well, with the function call, the same thing occurs. we are able to call the function even before it appears in our code. And notice also we're able to log to the console this variable, num. We didn't get the value, but we're able to log something without an error. That's something that's pretty unique to JavaScript. Other languages, this sort of structure would cause an error. But because of the way the execution context is set up, this variable is declared. It's already allocated space in memory. It doesn't have a value yet, and so the value ends up being undefined. It's undefined until something is assigned to it. And so when we log it to the console, it shows undefined. Now also this function is placed in memory. So that's done in the creation phase. Once we get the execution phase and we invoke that function, it's already in memory. So it already has access to it and it can invoke it and run it. Now if we add another console log statement down here for num, we would of course, and save that, we would of course get a 10 at that point. Because now we're in the execution phase, it's assigning the value and we're able to see it. Now, this phenomenon in JavaScript is called hoisting, which we're going to talk about very shortly. But now you're seeing the mechanics of why it happens. And it's because of the two phases of setting up the execution context. The creation phase and the execution phase. Now, something really quick to point out here that we'll discuss in more detail very shortly. But if this were let or const, so if we were declaring this variable with let or const, this would not happen. Let's go ahead and change that. So let. Now we get the error. Uncaught reference error. Cannot access num before initialization. That's what we would expect to happen in some other languages. And that's because let and const, I'll do the same thing with const here. This happens because let and const have a different intention. Their scope is different, which we'll talk about. So really quick, let's review those steps of the creation phase. The global object is created. This is set up and bound to the global object. And then inside the memory heap, any var declaration or function declaration are established in memory. And then during the execution phase, we execute the code line by line. Values that are assigned to variables and functions are invoked. Now, one last note here. When a function is invoked, it creates a new execution context. So we've been talking about the global execution context. That's the environment that our first bit of code runs in. Anything in the global environment. But when a function is invoked, it creates its own execution context, which we will talk about. Now, before we jump to the next topic and build on these concepts, I want to show you something that's kind of interesting about this execution context. So here's our HTML file. Let me go ahead and set that back so we're not getting an error. Now notice our variable name num and our function name, num function. Now remember those two things. And let's go ahead and take a look at the window object. This is the environment our code runs in. So how does it make use of this environment? Well, if we scroll down here to the ends, notice what we have. Here's our num variable, and it has a value. And here's our num function. And we can open that up and see what's set up for that function when it's established. So there's some tangible evidence of the execution context. We are making use of that global object that was set up for us. That's our context we're running in. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next topic.